a special edition of Raising the Conversation, a podcast from the MacRae Centre for Faith and Culture at Acadia Divinity College. In this mini-season, host Joel Murphy and guests dive into the topic of strained presence, as explored in our Navigating the Future report.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I am excited for today's conversations. I say that every week, but this is a little bit special for me. Today, we are joined by Kathleen Murphy, who is a clinical social worker and founder of Norwood Counseling. She specializes in attachment and trauma-responsive practices using somatic approaches and evidence-based methods to foster deep healing and meaningful connection. She is also completing her Master of Practical Theology at Acadia Divinity College, where she is marrying and looking at relational theology and attachment theory and developing a framework to enhance congregational care. And it just so happens that we are married. So I'm biased, obviously, to how amazing she is, but I think the work that both your clinical perspective as well as your research and your master's thesis, I think, is really relevant to the conversation we're having today, which is looking at the coming out of our upcoming Navigating the Future report, which is now available. One of the signals of change that I saw was around this idea of seeing people more emotionally and cognitively fatigued. And out of the research, we saw this element of spiritual bypassing. And I know that's something that you've talked about and engaged with it in your own research, as well as maybe in your own practice. So I was wondering if you could explain what the term or experience of spiritual bypassing means and how it can apply or how it's relevant to church leaders today.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. It's great to be here. So actually, spiritual bypassing, it was something that I was seeing in my practice as a clinical social worker offering mental health. But I didn't know that's what I was experiencing in the office. And so I actually just kind of happened to stumble across it as I was gaining a little bit of a reputation in the Annapolis Valley for my counseling skills, but then people found out that I was a Christian. And so I was getting a lot of referrals for people looking for Christian counseling. And I also had some pastors join my caseload as well. And what I was finding was that particularly with people who are asking for Christian counseling, is I was struggling to support them in processing some of their emotional experiences. And I didn't know what that was and why I was struggling to help them get there. And then I came across this term spiritual bypassing, and this is what led me to decide to go back and finish my master's in theology. So spiritual bypassing was a term that was coined by John Welwood in 1984. So it's been around for a while, but the prevalence of spiritual bypassing in research is only just now catching up with it. And it really means that we use either theological beliefs, practices, or our convictions to avoid adverse emotions or feelings of suffering. It's almost like we kind of over-spiritualize what our experiences are, but it's to then the detriment of what the emotional experience has been for us. So it's actually a maladaptive strategy, a coping strategy when we think about going through pain or suffering. And so like all coping strategies work until they don't work. And so in 2017, there was actually a tool developed to measure the extent of spiritual bypassing. And in that tool, it validated that yes, if we use spiritual bypassing to help us mitigate our emotional experiences, help us to avoid them, it actually does help us feel better, but only for the short term. And this tool actually demonstrated that long term, those feelings actually catch up to us and then increase our anxiety, our depression, and other presenting mental health concerns.
Wow.
So when we think about what spiritual bypassing actually looks like, it can be very subtle or it can be very overt. But you might have heard this, like if you've grown up in the church, it could be things like statements that are given to us that are like, "Oh, we'll just choose joy," or "Let's just give it to God," or "Don't worry, God is in control." And so there's a tension because of course there are beliefs that we can believe about God and his character, and those things are true. And also it can be to the detriment of dismissing what the emotional experience is at the same time. Another kind of example of spiritual bypassing that I've seen is this idea of premature forgiveness, where it's like, well, let's just forgive and forget. And yes, we are taught to like that we need to forgive, but if we just move to this quick forgetfulness of whatever transpired, that's where we lose opportunity for integration of the experience or holding people accountable, or even to the detriment of us reestablishing a sense of safety in relationships. Um, so it's definitely this avoidance of emotions, and we're using our faith to do that in different ways.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, which like I think like we've obviously talked about this
Yes, we
around the dinner table, but like I think the thing that I'm so struck by the research you're doing, but also then how you're doing it even with your own practices, it's this point in time, and again coming through our research, like people are really struggling with their well-being, their mental health. Like there's lots of research to support that increases loneliness, particularly in younger generations, but I think across the board. Um, and I know that you have a heart for supporting people both on an individual through your own practice, which is not explicitly Christian. It's just people coming to seek your services, and but like when you think about the context of like church leaders or like faith communities, like how can people and how can they themselves be able to navigate this? Because you're articulating a really strong tension of beliefs, and like we can hold two truths at once, right? Like God is still good, and thing can still be hard, and you have to do like, and that feels like a hard tension potentially for people to hold. So like, how could church leaders support individuals to do that well?
Yeah, and that's a good question. And I think it's important to note that like this is generally isn't a conscious choice, right? People don't necessarily say, "Oh, I don't want to experience this feeling of distress or disappointment, so therefore God's in control. It's all good." It's usually an ethos that we grew up with in a church, or a theology that's being presented. And so it's very unconscious. It just happens to stagnate that personal development, right? So I think it's important to hold that in our awareness that people are intentionally using spiritual bypassing, but it just so happens to be
Mhm.
prevalent for some.
That's a good note.
So yeah, and I think it's like you mentioned that tension, right? It's um, we need to leave room for lament, for protest, or for truth telling, and also like how does our theology offer us hope and faith in the midst of hard times? So I think the short answer to your question, Joel, about like how church leaders can support individuals, with the very relevant mental health things happening. The short answer is prioritizing relationships and personal wellness. I would say those are kind of the two things. And so when I think about prioritizing relationships, the word intentionality always comes to me. And it's twofold. Like to be intentional, we also need to be aware and recognize the prevalence of mental health or the stories that people are sitting with that are in the pews every week, right? Um, and it's intentionally, as a church leader, thinking and asking ourselves, how do I want to meet these people? How do I want to build relationships? How can I support them in their wounded places? And really, and what my research is kind of focusing on is how do we look beyond the behavior that we see and actually see the emotional needs of the people who are showing up and looking for something. Because the reality is people are coming back to church, and they're coming back to church because they're looking for relief.
Hmm.
Um, and so it's how can we prioritize relationships so that we can support them in some of these wounded places or in their hard times. And so it's intentionality, and then I think it's time and space. To build relationships take time. And so that would look like prioritizing, like having a shared meal, having a coffee. but it's time to build the trust. And then it's also offering space for people that's safe, that's non-judgmental, where they feel like they can show up and be their true authentic selves without judgment and blame. So ultimately, we're creating emotional safety, right? In the context of relationships. And when we hear mental health, we should also automatically hear emotional safety in that.
Hmm.
Um, so how can pastors support that? I would say they need to prioritize relationships, offer that emotional safety. Um, and with spiritual bypassing, I think it ultimately calls us to do a self-reflection on what is our theology, right? And our beliefs and really defining that clearly and seeing how that shows up. And then the twofold part was also the self-awareness, the personal self-awareness and self-wellness. So pastors and church leaders need to also take care of themselves in order to support others. In order to hold space for others, they need their own collective, their own support system, people who are holding space for them. Because if we are trying to do it alone, we will struggle, right? It is costly to support suffering ultimately and be with people in the muck and the wrestling. So when I talk about like self-care, self-wellness in my practice, I often kind of talk about it as like what's the padding that we can kind of put around ourselves. And it can look like lots of things. It's not just one. And so it's helping people get curious about what are multiple things that they can do to support themselves so that they can support others. So is it close friends? Is it having your own spiritual director? Or do you go on retreats? Are there opportunities for retreats? Rest, vacation, spiritual disciplines, an accountability partner. And I think the biggest one for pastoral leaders too is also boundaries.
Hmm.
Research is showing that pastors, pastoral leaders, clergy are burning out. And one of the main reasons is because of a lack of boundaries, because there's this mentality that ministry is a lifestyle. And so, yes, I will get a call at 10 o'clock at night. And yes, I'm doing a hospital visit, at 1 a.m. or whatever that might look like. And so boundaries is also a huge protective factor for our own sense of wellness when we can delineate between work and lifestyle.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah. I think what really stood out of the report for me as I was engaging with it, and then it's not easy, and I think like this feels like there's an underlying sense of people like as they're coming into spaces, how can we be sensitive, like you said, and be aware that I think people are tired and that people are like there's just so much stuff happening in the world, and like we're constantly bombarded with different things, and so people are already at this high level of being overly stimulated that there's I think inherently it's a struggle for people. So when they have a space like the church where they can come in and have a religious experience, which lots of research validates the positive benefits of that. The concern I have around it, and I think, is that it could just be like almost like a momentary relief, like an emotional balm, and that it wouldn't actually help and like have that long term, like you said, they'll bypass the negative emotions to experience something positive, but that actually won't necessarily necessitate a long-term health or long-term transformation in relationship with Jesus. And so I think it's a really crucial time for church leaders and pastors to be able to be sensitive to how can you invite people, like you said, into the space, and like relationship is a big part of that.
Yeah. And I think it's also important to note that it can't just be a pastoral leader supporting a congregation. So, I think it really, so maybe the pastor, the pastoral leader is the one that initially bridges that relationship and sees somebody sitting in the pew and says, welcome here, and gets to know them and has a coffee. But, I think health of a church would then look like helping those people then get bridged into the greater church, the greater community, where then they're building a collective around them too, so that it's a whole community supporting one another versus just leadership, right? And so then it's also kind of this intentionality of how do I equip my leadership team at church, and how do I invite people in to take a more intentional role in supporting relationships and catching people. People need to be caught, and they're looking for the church to catch them.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I think that like, and we'll conclude with our last question, because I know we could talk for
Mhm.
forever. And maybe we can talk over dinner. um, like I think the thing that really stood out for me out of this report was the idea of like there's a lot, this is hard. And I think at this point in time, like there's a lot of, like you said, people are looking for that, and that can be both a scary, daunting thing and be pretty negative, but also that there's a lot of opportunity in that, where people are wanting to have a sense of belonging, to have a sense of connection. And what a better place for the church if the church could provide that in ways that's meaningful and intentional, using your word. So I guess the final question as we conclude our time is like, what hope do you have for the future church based on your own research or the work that you're doing? Like what stands out for you?
Yeah, I think my hope for church is that it actually becomes a landing place where people feel like they are fully accepted, that they belong, and that they have a genuine and authentic connection. And I think in order for church to do that well, this word, a holy wrestle, is being impressed upon me, that churches can embody and allow space for this holy wrestle, for people to wrestle through what they believe about God, why bad things happen to them, for church to hold space for them to feel the emotions, to process through, to integrate those emotions while also holding faith, and that church can hold ultimately this gray space. Because when we think about how society is going and the political unrest and the influence of technology and AI, like it feels scary, it feels daunting, and people are swinging back to wanting absolutes. They want the black and white. What is something we can like anchor ourselves in that's for certain. And so churches can offer that faith, that the scripture, there is an element to that, but it can also swing too far to the point where then it's like, well, we've always done it this way, and so we will keep doing it this way. And there's no room for questioning. You just got to believe, you just got to pray more. And I think in order for churches to catch people where they are today and what they are experiencing today, they have to leave room for gray, not black and white, for the holy wrestle, for people to question their theology, what it means, how God is showing up, for them to experience the whole gamut of emotions, and for God to meet them in those places. And that's okay. They're still welcome. No judgment. You can wrestle here with us, and we got you, and we will be in the wrestle with you, not judging you and not watching you, but in it with you. And I think that's my hope for the church, because I honestly think as I sit with clients day in, day out, hearing about their emotional experiences, what life is like for them, the resiliency that so many people have, it's needing space to do that. And the church has immense opportunity to catch people in ways that as a single therapist, I never could, right? Because it's a collective body with a beautiful mission and vision.
Love that. The holy wrestle. That's a lovely word. And I think, yeah, place to end. I really appreciate this. Thanks for saying yes. I really do love you and appreciate what the work you're doing, both out of like, this is just really compelling, and I think is really important for pastoral leaders and church and Christian leaders to be engaging with and thinking about it. It's not a simple like, there's complexity, there's color, there's gray. And so thank you for outlining the holy wrestle, and I pray that I hope that we can be able to engage with that. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Joel. Appreciate it.